twist this because we're not quite right here. When we think about photosynthesis, you think, oh, plants photosynthesize. And you're not wrong. You're just incomplete. Okay? You're not wrong. You're just incomplete. And so lots of things actually photosynthesize. Anything that we would call an autotroph would photosynthesize. And let's turn all of that down. Perfect. But there's some things that are not plants that also photosynthesize. Algae is a great example of that. Algae is an awesome example. It's not actually a plant. It looks like a plant, but it's not. It's a different group of organisms altogether. It's hard for us to think about algae in Colorado because it's an ocean thing. We don't have those here. But what we have with algae is an area of research that we're trying to figure out how to use algae for biofuels, because in nutrient-rich warm waters, algae can grow as quickly as a foot a day. Very quickly. Remember, all of the tissue of a plant is actually carbon-based, right? It's an organism. These are organic molecules. If it's a carbon-based molecule, where'd the carbon come from? CO2. It's the only place it could come from, right? So all of this was once CO2 that was taken in from the atmosphere. So if we think about an algae organism that is taking in enough CO2 from the atmosphere to grow a foot a day, that is an intense bucket, if you will, of CO2 coming out of the atmosphere. And so the idea behind biofuels and renewable energy is just to say we need to be able to recreate it as quickly as we use it, and that's a tall order, right? And that's one of the issues that we have with oil. How long does it take for the planet to actually produce oil? Thousands and tens of thousands of years, right? That's the whole compression and earth science thing. But if instead we can speed up that carbon cycle into something like algae, where we can burn it and then it can be fixed back into that plant in a very rapid state, that's very fortuitous, right? That's very, very useful. So right now, algae is an awesome area of research for biofuels for that very reason, for how quickly they incorporate carbon into their organisms. We also have some unicellular organisms that engage in photosynthesis, both eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So eukaryotes, of course, having a nucleus, you can't really see it in this picture, but having a nucleus, having chloroplasts in there that are engaging in photosynthesis. But then we also have some bacteria, so prokaryotes, no chloroplasts, so prokaryotes, none of that endomembrane system, no membrane-bound organelles, which means no mitochondria and no chloroplasts. Right? So how are they engaging in this? Well, they have all these infoldings of membrane within the organism that's actually allowing them to engage in these membrane processes. Because like we talked about with cellular respiration, you have to have a membrane across which to create that charged battery. Well, if you don't have a membrane in a mitochondria, you have to have infoldings of that plasma membrane in order to make it happen. Same kind of philosophy here. We tend to think about photosynthesis with regard to green plants, but there are pigments of other colors. Okay. Purple is a good example. Not only do we have the purple leaf plant that we're using today, that's a pigment, but purple sulfobacteria, another example. Okay. Able to engage in photosynthesis even though it doesn't have a green color to it. And when we talk about light reactions next class, which is, of course, in 9 days, we're going to talk about what's the difference between these pigments. Why are some of them purple and some of them green? Okay. So just a quick overview. Life on Earth is absolutely solar powered. You got this, buddy. There we go. Okay. Life on Earth is solar powered. What do I mean by that? I mean, even if I were a strict carnivore and I only ate meat, I would be eating things that, even if it was 2 or 3 organisms removed, something along the way had to eat grass or plants. And if it weren't for that grass or plants, we would not have this network of food chains called food webs. Because it all starts at that producer level. When we say producer, remember, they are producing fuels for the ecosystem. And we're producing calories, right? Setting an energy budget. So photosynthesis, even indirectly, nourishes our entire planet. 2 quick vocab words for you, autotrophs and heterotrophs. Auto means self, troph is have heterotrophs, that's us. So other feeders, things that have to eat other things in order to survive. The one that's tricky in this context is fungus. A lot of times kids are like, what's growing out of the ground? Oh, it must be an autotroph. What color are most fungi? Around here, what color are they? Brown or white? A lot of them are white. They don't have pigments. Okay, they're not absorbing energy. They are decomposers. The role of fungi in the environment is that they are decomposers. They are taking dead or decaying matter and breaking it down into its constituents and literally absorbing those things out of the ground. So we don't get a lot of mushrooms out here unless it rains, right? And the reason that happens is because when it rains, that's when mushrooms have a lot of opportunity to be absorbing this matter. Okay? But to that end, our mushrooms, our fungi, are heterotrophs. Okay? So don't only think about heterotrophs, things that eat as animals. It's a trap to fall into for sure. They're not only animals. Fungi fit into that category as well. So this is kind of a summary of what I was saying earlier, but I'll do it again just to be complete. It says all the green parts of a plant contain chloroplast, and inside the chloroplast is chlorophyll. And so that's what I was just saying about this, right? Chlorophyll is a liquid. It's a pigment. When you played soccer and you wore white pants and you went skidding across the lawn, when you were finished, your white pants had a lovely green streak down the side. That was the chlorophyll that was in the grass. When you went sliding down, you broke open the cells, you broke open the chloroplast, and all of that chlorophyll, that liquid chlorophyll that's held on the inside, is left behind on your hands. Right? That stuff doesn't come out. Okay, it's there forever. Okay? So the plant itself has this liquid chlorophyll, this pigment on the inside of it. That's that chlorophyll that's absorbing the light energy from the sun that's going to drive the synthesis of those organic molecules into the chloroplast. So that's where we have the photo is absorbing the light, and the synthesis is producing the glucose. A little bit of anatomy of a leaf. Okay, a little bit of anatomy. So you should recognize this image. We showed you this back in Unit 2. Okay, we learned about the stroma being the fluid, the thylakoid, or the granum here is the whole stack, the thylakoid, sorry, over here. Okay, we're going to see that photosynthesis involves membrane-bound proteins, and we have to charge the battery again, just like we did in cellular respiration. Only in cellular respiration, we talked about doing this across the mitochondrial membrane, okay, in that intermembrane space versus the mitochondrial matrix. We're going to be doing that same sort of reaction type across the thylakoid membranes in this case. So notice how here with your chloroplast, you don't have all those infoldings. Remember with the mitochondria, you have all those fingers that come in, and that's where you had your electron transport chain. Notice we don't have that here. The membranes are actually in these thylakoids, right, in our stacked hamburger buns there. That's the membranes that we're going to use for a good chunk of these reactions. Okay. And then, of course, again, the pigment itself is in here. Up at the top, I want you to notice the stomata. Here they are, here they are, here they are. So I'm going to go back 2 slides. So here's our general reaction for photosynthesis. Of course, just like cellular respiration, where there's literally dozens or even 100 different steps to this process, in photosynthesis, we're going to break it down or say, here's the overall reaction that we have. CO2 plus water plus energy makes glucose plus oxygen. So in this case, what the plant is trying to produce is the glucose. The oxygen is waste. The oxygen is waste. And we have to remember that equilibrium, chemical equilibrium for an organism is a bad thing. Okay? In chemistry, we talk about reactions going to equilibrium. In biology, we never, ever, ever want that to be the case. We never want stuff to go to equilibrium because that means we're dead, right? So we have to constantly be getting rid of the products and constantly be taking in the reactants. And the goal is to be sure that we never hit equilibrium. Constantly bringing in the reactants, getting rid of the products. Constantly, constantly, constantly. So how do you do that? Well, if you want this, as soon as it's produced, you send it away. If you don't want this, as soon as it's produced, you expel it, get rid of it. If you need this, you bring it in from the atmosphere. If you need this, you bring it up from your roots. If you need this, you capture it from the sun. But the trick is, we have to bring this in from the atmosphere, and we have to get rid of that. Both of them are gases. Both of them are small, non-polar molecules, which means they can do what? Diffuse across the membrane. That's exactly right. So all we have to do is allow those gases access to those cellular membranes. Because we know that if they have access to those membranes, they're going to diffuse across it, right? Because we're consuming it in the chemical reaction. So what do? We have these holes, tiny, tiny holes on the bottom surface of leaves that can be opened to allow the CO2 to come in and the oxygen to be released. So that we bring in our reactants and we release the products. That's what those tiny holes are for. Now we have a little bit of an issue, because despite that all this that I said is really good, something else leaves through that hole. Water. We don't like it. We want to keep our water, because remember, we needed the water. Okay? So the loss of water is actually not good. We call that transpiration. You've probably heard of it. It's part of the water cycle. We're going to do a huge lab with it in the spring. But for now, I want you to understand that we have these holes because we must allow for gas exchange. We must allow the CO2 to come in and the oxygen to leave, so that that cell, that chemical reaction, never actually hits equilibrium, because that would be very, very bad. So to kind of give you some context, the light green cells up here, those are the mesophyll cells. Inside the mesophyll cells, they're just specialized cells that contain a lot of chloroplasts. That's what they are. So they contain all these chloroplasts. That's what they look like. Okay, there's your mesophyll cell, or an actual picture of one. And each chloroplast looks like this. Highly specialized cells whose task it is to undergo photosynthesis, and that's it. So then what we have is the vein. Remember I told you we had to get rid of the glucose? That's where we send our glucose. The goal is that the leaves make the glucose, but the trick is making glucose isn't our only issue. We need to take that glucose and send it to the mitochondria and allow it to do what? Make ATP, right? Plants need ATP for the chemical and the transport and mechanical processes, just like animals do, right? They don't need as much of it, but they need it nonetheless. So that glucose can go to a mitochondria to produce ATP. That glucose can go to, I don't know, a fruit that's developing, right? Because remember, the idea behind fruit is to nourish seeds once they've been planted, right? That glucose can be sent to the roots for storage for spring, because a tree is going to need to leaf out, grow leaves, which requires an awful lot of ATP. But if you don't have leaves, you got to get that ATP from somewhere. So they store ATP in their roots over the winter, and then tap into that in the spring to grow new leaves for the next year. So the ATP can be used for all, or the glucose can be used for all sorts of different things. Okay, but the storage molecule is going to be that glucose. So here's the actual image. This is exactly what you guys are going to be looking at a little bit later on today, and what's drying on your leaf at this moment. And so, of course, this is the fingernail polish image. And what you can see is a stomata here, 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 and here looks like the corner of one, but I can't tell for sure. So if I were counting the stomata in this field of view, I'd count 4. Okay. You'll notice that this dark area here is actually the hole where the gas comes and goes. Around it, we have 2 cells, one on this side and one on this side, called guard cells. And those guard cells are the things that are actually controlling whether or not that hole is open or closed. But I want you to think about why it would be useful to close it. Like, that sounds bad, because then we can hit equilibrium. Well, the only time we're undergoing photosynthesis, for the most part, is in the daytime. Would you agree that that's true? Because that's when the lights come. We'll talk about exceptions to that later. But there would be no reason to leave the stomata open at night when you're not undergoing photosynthesis, and the only consequence to an open stomata is that you're losing water. Okay, so you would use these guard cells to shut down those stomata at night so that you're not losing water without producing ATP or glucose. The overall chemical change that we have in this reaction is the opposite of cellular respiration. And in ecological terms, again, we call that the carbon cycle. Carbon is absorbed from the atmosphere, fixed into these molecules, and then burned, sometimes by cars if it's a biofuel, and sometimes by organisms who use them for energy. And CO2 is returned to the planet. It's important to note something simple. We talk about glucose here to very clearly relate these two processes as opposite. That's what we're looking to do. The actual product of photosynthesis is something called G3P. G3P is a 3-carbon sugar. And all we have to do is put 2 G3Ps together in order to make the 6-carbon sugar glucose. But the reason photosynthesis actually produces G3P is because plants need all sorts of different compounds, organic compounds. And G3P is like the building block. And then you can build whatever you need to out of the G3P building block. Okay? But we start with that. So here it is in sum. Here is the reaction for both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. When we go this way, it's photosynthesis. When we go the other direction, it's cellular respiration. Energy is sunlight in this direction. Energy is ATP in this direction. CO2 and water is waste in this direction. Oxygen is waste in the opposite direction. The 2 sets of reactions are opposite each other. So for a very long time, scientists had a hard time figuring out where the different reactions and products were coming from and being formed. And in the world of reactants, what we found through the use of something called heavy oxygen. Heavy oxygen is literally heavy oxygen molecules. Like, what is that? Oxygen usually has a mass of 16, right? It's going to be 8 protons and 8 neutrons. It's normal. Heavy oxygen has 8 protons. You can't change that, but it has 10 neutrons. Okay, heavy oxygen. The reason it matters is because you can track it. It's easy to see it, to follow it as these reactions occur. So a very smart scientist created a bunch of CO2 and water using heavy oxygen, and then bombarded plants with them in turn to see where the heavy oxygen ended up. Well, what they found is that the CO2 actually stays together, so the gas becomes the sugar, and the water releases the oxygen, and then the hydrogens go both to the glucose, but then also to the water that's produced. Why does this matter? It matters hugely. Because it tells us that the water is the source of electrons. Remember how I told you that light is bombarding us, but that light does not have matter, it's not matter? So the electrons have to come from somewhere, because the electrons are how we store the energy. Where do the electrons come from? They come from water. So why do we water our plants? Well, first, because we're losing water via transpiration, but water is crucial for photosynthesis because water is the source of electrons for plants. Where do those electrons go? They go over here. So when we take this molecule and we add electrons to it, is that reducing it or oxidizing it? We have reduced it, exactly. So we've added electrons. We took our CO2, we added electrons, and we made glucose. Remember, the electrons are always traveling with the hydrogens. The electrons are always traveling with the hydrogens. So the electrons come in here. Where did the electrons come from? They came from our water. Okay? So this is what I was just saying. Photosynthesis is a redox process similar to cellular respiration, just backwards. Remember, this means cellular respiration. In cellular respiration, that energy is released from sugar when electrons, and those electrons are associated with the hydrogens, are transported by carriers to oxygen, forming water as a byproduct. Those electrons lose potential energy as they fall down the electron transport chain toward oxygen. The mitochondria harness that energy to produce ATP. We're just going to do it backwards. In photosynthesis, electron flow is reversed. Remember, the product in water. But remember, the reason that we were able to end with water and cellular respiration was just simply because oxygen is so electronegative. And those electrons are held really, really close to oxygen. So if we're going to take electrons away from water, that is going to be a tall order, right? Because the whole premise of cellular respiration was that oxygen really wanted the electron. That has not changed. So how do we convince a water to give up its electron? Energy. We feed it with energy. Where does that energy come from? The sun. Okay? The sun. That's what I just said. So, in essence, we take our CO2 from the atmosphere, we reduce it, and it becomes glucose. And we take our water, probably from the roots, we oxidize it, and it becomes oxygen gas. This is probably the most important diagram in the whole chapter. Right here, let's start next to that. So to complete photosynthesis, again, we have two parts of this reaction. We have the photo part, we call those the light reactions, and we have the synthesis part. The synthesis part can be called all sorts of things. In this diagram, we call it the Calvin cycle. It can also be called carbon fixation, because we're collecting carbons from the atmosphere and fixing them into a molecule. It can also be called the dark reactions. Okay. But in essence, what you're going to see here is that in where the pigments occur, so that's what we said at the beginning, where the pigment is, inside our granum, water comes in, that is the source of your electrons. Light comes in to convince water to let go of those electrons. Hydrogen and electrons, those activated electrons are trapped in the molecule ATP and NADPH, an electron carrier. And what's left? Oxygen. Notice our electron carrier here has a P in it. It's a different electron carrier than the one we have in cellular respiration. I wish I could tell you that the P stands for photosynthesis. It doesn't. I think it's phosphorus or something like that. But we're still going to use the P to remember that it's the one we use in photosynthesis. NADPH, photosynthesis. That comes over here because in the synthesis part of our reaction, this is endergonic. Over here, we're collecting all those CO2s, and we are building a bigger molecule, building a bigger molecule, building a bigger molecule. That requires a massive investment of energy. So we use the energy that we've trapped in our ATP and our NADPH, we use that energy to push forward the endergonic reactions that occur in the Calvin cycle, where we are reducing our molecular clutter, where we have a delta G that is positive. We use this to drive this forward. Okay? So next class, I focus on this for a whole lecture, and the class after that, I focus on this for a whole lecture, and we just go nice and slow to the start. This is just summarizing what I just said. The Calvin cycle, those dark reactions incorporate CO2 from the air into those organic molecules already present in the chloroplast. We call that carbon fixation. That cycle reduces the fixed carbon to carbohydrates by addition of electrons. So we just add in those electrons that came from water. That reducing power comes from NADPH, that electron carrier, which received the electrons from the light reactions. So the electrons are coming from water, being increased in energy from the sun, being transferred to NADPH, and the NADPH is then going to reduce the glucose molecule. So the reduction is actually happening in the Calvin cycle. The light reactions are what are oxidizing our H2O. Long story short, that chloroplast is using the light energy to make sugar by coordinating the photo and the synthesis. There, at no point is there an export of ATP. I want to make that clear, because in this diagram it shows you that we're producing ATP and NADPH. All of the ATP and NADPH that is produced in the light reactions is rapidly consumed in the Calvin cycle. At no point does the ATP leave the cell to fuel something else. At no point does this electron carrier scooch off to a mitochondria to drop off its electron. They stay within the chloroplast, okay, NADPH. end of today's lecture.
Yay.